Hello, my name is Jordan Workema, and I would like to discuss today childhood trauma and neurodevelopment. Trauma is a pretty complex concept. However, it can be understood as how the mind and body respond to an event that is out of one's control. It is usually something that is overwhelming for the individual and it initiates the fight or flight response. So, this could include events such as witnessing a death, being in a car accident, experiencing domestic violence within the family, experiencing physical abuse or sexual abuse or neglect. And it can include a lot of other things. And things that are traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for the next. It's very dependent on the individual. A traumatic experience that has long lasting and significant effects on a person can develop into post traumatic stress disorder. And post traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is typically marked by four categories of symptoms. And those symptoms are intrusion, arousal, negative emotion, and avoidance. So, what a intrusion might look like is someone having nightmares or flashbacks of the event, and this could come up at any moment, often because of a trigger of some sort. And for arousal, this could look like someone being extra irritable or hypervigilant of their surroundings. A person who's aroused due to their PTSD might be constantly looking for threats in the environment. For negative emotions that are common for people with PTSD might be guilt, shame, or anger. And there are many more negative emotions that someone might experience depending on what the event was that happened. And for avoidance, this could look like someone self isolating, um, majorly because they are avoiding either reminders of the event or avoiding things that um, trigger emotions or feelings from the event. So, all of the symptoms that we see in someone who has experienced a traumatic event are actually related to systemic changes within the brain. So, there are three systems of the brain that I would like to highlight here, one of which is the threat system, and also the memory system, and lastly, the reward system of the brain. The threat system of the brain is largely controlled by the amygdala. And while this is a very small portion of the brain, it has the ability to take control of the mind, especially for someone who has experienced trauma. The amygdala is often referred to as the smoke alarm of the brain, and this is because it is always on high alert and it will alarm the brain when it senses a threat in the environment. So when the amygdala goes off, it tells the body that they are in danger and it kicks the body into its sympathetic nervous system, which involves an increased heart rate and increased breathing um, and increased senses overall. So, after a traumatic experience, the amygdala becomes much more active, and this is visibly seen in brain scans of individuals who have experienced trauma. And the amygdala is um, active more just throughout the day, not in times of actual danger, but in times of perceived danger. And the sense of danger becomes skewed after trauma. However, it is a way for the brain to protect oneself because it has experienced danger before. The amygdala is also associated with the triggers that we see in people with PTSD. Once something is sensed that is a trigger involved with the traumatic experience, then the body is flipped into that fight or flight response. And this can bring somebody right into a flashback of that prior experience. So, the memory system of the brain is largely composed of the hippocampus. So, the hippocampus is responsible for processing memories and emotions. And brain scans show that the hippocampus actually shrinks following trauma. This is something that is a bit interesting in relation to trauma because one might not think automatically that memory is related to trauma. However, people who have experienced a traumatic event often find it hard to remember aspects of the event. And this is because when someone is put into that alarm state, the fight or flight state, that part of their brain isn't being used as much as the survival parts of their brain, which are like their brainstem and their amygdala that is on high alert. So people who've experienced trauma might have difficulty remembering things correctly, and they also this isn't related to experiencing flashbacks. The hippocampus might not function properly and might bring up memories in times where it doesn't make sense. And this is also related to the triggers from that are initiated by the amygdala. So the last part of the brain that I would like to touch on is the prefrontal cortex. So this is part of the larger cortex of the brain, and it sits at the front of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher order thinking, such as judgment and decision making and rational thought. Somebody who has experienced trauma might find it hard to access this part of their brain in many parts of the day due to the amygdala being activated. Because when that fight or flight response is in queue, then one way you could look at it is somebody's lid being flipped and their amygdala rests underneath, and this being the cortex. So when that lid is flipped, it's hard to access the thinking part of someone's brain. And in a child, this might look like in a school setting if child is triggered by something in their environment and they've experienced trauma, um, then they might not be able to remember a simple math problem or seemingly simple answer when their sympathetic nervous system is in action and they are kind of in survival mode, even if there's not a real threat in the environment. So, the prefrontal cortex, as seen in brain scans, again, shrinks after trauma. So, here I would like to show you a short clip of what it might look like for a child's brain who has undergone some trauma. So, as we can see from the video, it gives us a little bit of a picture of what might be going on inside the brain of a child who has experienced trauma. So, the reason for the changes within the brain is due to neuroplasticity, which means that the brain is constantly changing in response to experiences in life and in response to things like trauma. So, neuroplasticity is very critical in the first few years of life. From the time a child is born till around 7 is when the majority of brain development happens at a rapid pace because they are constantly building new connections. And during this time, some synapses in the brain are enhanced while others are not. And when something is happening repetitively, then that synapse becomes stronger. And this is all learned from the environment, but the brain adapts to whatever is happening in the child's environment. So when trauma is introduced during this period of a child's life, it becomes integrated into their brain development. And this can make it more difficult for a child to counteract what has changed in their brain. But that's why it's important to recognize trauma in children at an early age. First of all, be able to prevent it from happening. But if it does happen, it's important to address it early on so that we can work on adapting the brain in the opposite direction. So it is a beautiful thing that the brain can adapt in response to trauma. And sometimes it is useful and sometimes necessary for survival. So while the brain adapts in this way, it can become unuseful to a point where it's not serving the child anymore. Um, so while the brain does adapt, it also has the power to change again. So next, I will talk about some of the different treatments that target the brain. So, one of the most common treatments for trauma is TFCBT, which is trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is an adaptation of normal CBT with a focus on the traumatic experience. So, with a child, this might look like focusing on their unique responses to the trauma, the symptoms that they're experiencing, along with creating a trauma narrative that tells their story and some in vivo exposure and ending with safety planning for the future. So, how TFCBT focuses on the brain is through targeting cognitions. So, with the changes in the brain, it can impact the way someone thinks about their safety. Their perceived safety might be very different from someone who has not experienced a traumatic event. So, TFCBT works to alter those unhelpful cognitions. Another common treatment for people who've experienced trauma is EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So, this is all about rewiring the connections in the brain. It's very focused on those brain changes as a result of trauma. So, with EMDR, the goal is to um, reprocess an event. So, while thinking about the event, um, they will look side to side at an object, which um, connects the two sides of the brain. And the goal is to for the client to reprocess that event, and it actually helps them gain a new perspective about it in a calm and controlled environment. So, a third treatment that is common and a little bit newer for treatment of trauma is neurofeedback. So, this is very focused on the brain as well, and it works with sending various brain waves through the brain in real time with a client. And the goal is to send calming brain waves while they are thinking about the event to also reprocess that event. And the brain can adapt to not be in that heightened state anymore and for the amygdala to not be active while they're thinking about it. So these both, or all three of these treatments seem to be really helpful for people with PTSD. I also wanted to note that it's important to not forget about what we cannot see. So, with these symptoms, especially in children, they can come off as being very irritable and misbehaving. But it's important to think about where that's coming from and how it's actually, um, they're neurologically wired differently because of what they've been through. So here I would like to show you a short clip about EMDR therapy and how talk therapy is not always the best option for people. While it's important to understand various treatments out there for severe trauma, I think it's also important in general to look at how people function differently depending on what state they're in. And different parts of the brain are also active depending on the state one is in. So, this chart here is from one of my favorite books called What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. So, this book is about trauma in the brain and resilience. So, he points out how in all these different states, so calm, alert, alarm, fear, and terror, we function on a different level. So, jumping down to the bottom row, even our IQ changes. This is also dependent on the individual, but our IQ can change based on um, the state we're in. And this is sometimes common sense because we know that when we are feeling calm, we can function well and reflect on things and create and be abstract. That's usually when we can function at our best. When we are alert, this might be if you're feeling slightly anxious about something, then you might feel hypervigilant or avoidant, and your IQ might function a little bit lower. You might not be able to think of things as quickly. So, this is important to take into account when working with people who've experienced trauma, especially kids, and in an educational setting, because paying attention to what state they're in will show what they're able to accomplish in that moment. And being able to bring them to a calm state is going to be important for any progress to be made. So, trauma can have a significant impact on learning. And as we see how it has an impact on neurological development, that also plays a role in the classroom. And it's important to understand the neurological functioning of a child who has a trauma history because a child who's experienced trauma might just look like they're misbehaving in the classroom. They might be acting out because they are frustrated more quickly, or they're in a hyper aroused state and they cannot function properly, like we saw before in the state dependent functioning chart. So, some kids just simply don't feel safe at school. Um, that might be because of their peers or situations that they end up in, but this is important to note because the perceived safety often of a child who's experienced trauma um, impacts the way that they exist in a room full of people and in different environments where there is a lot going on. Some kids grow up in a environment of chaos and disorder, and that's what they become used to, and so they're constantly adapting to changes and trying to figure out how to best keep themselves safe. So that's what they're going to be focused on, and they won't be in that calm state where they will function at their best. So when a child is not calm, it makes it difficult to access that thinking part of their brain. And this is important to note because some kids who are able to be, which is most kids who are able to be in that calm state for most of the day at school or wherever they are learning, they have that advantage because they're able to learn and function at their best, while other students who not only are they not able to function at their best, but they are being blamed for their behavior. And usually, an educator or anyone who's working with a child who is quote unquote misbehaving often, they believe that the behavior is intentional or targeted at them most of the time. So, this is why trauma informed care is important to implement into schools. And that is just one of my recommendations, but I will talk next about some more of my recommendations with this information. So, here are a few of the recommendations I have going forward with what we know about how trauma impacts the brain during childhood. So, first off, I believe there should be more focus on early childhood support for both the children and parents because of how critical the first 7 or so years of life are for brain development. Being exposed to trauma in that time can be really detrimental. And while we know there are ways to help this, it's always best to figure out how we can prevent it. And I believe providing more support through parental education and putting more of a focus on the importance of early childhood health and safety is going to be the best option moving forward for our kids. I also think it's important to continue searching for ways to help rewire parts of the brain that are impacted by trauma. We talked about the few treatments out there, and there are more modalities that focus on the brain. But I think that's where the root of the symptoms are, and having those stress symptoms as a result of PTSD takes a toll on the brain and the body, and it can have long lasting impacts. And people are able to adapt to those symptoms, but to really live a better life, it's important for trauma victims to get the help that they need and to be able to overcome those neurological changes that they have been forced to adapt to. And third, I think it's important to look upstream at systemic issues that impact childhood experiences. And this involves things such as systemic racism and poverty that are a common experience for marginalized populations and can introduce trauma into a child's life at a young age. These are things to out for in school settings and any setting that works with kids. So, I really would like to work in a school moving forward. So, I hope to take some of this knowledge about trauma in the brain and how important that is for children as well, and to translate this knowledge into practice. Thank you so much for listening.